Hi, and welcome to the One Life Church devotional series where we cover the entire Bible in 20 months. Well, today's chapters are 2 Samuel 10 and 1 Corinthians chapter 7. In 2 Samuel 10, David's ally, the king of the Ammonites, dies. And so David sends an envoy to his grieving son Hanun and says, I commiserate with you, I grieve with you. But Hanun must have been a piece of work, but he says, you're not coming here to grieve, you're coming here to spy on me. So he chops the beard in half of all David's men and shaves their garments off at their buttocks, so they've got to run home sort of half naked. Well, David sends out a group to meet them on the way and says, listen, stay in Jericho. Wait until your beard's fully grown, and then we'll sort out the Ammonites. Well, the Ammonites realize they'd made a stupid mistake, and so they get a formidable alliance, bring them up against Israel front and back, but David destroys them, takes them as his subjects, and David continues his march in establishing his kingdom. Now, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul turns his attention to marriage, to divorce, to widows, to virgins, to sexuality, and he has a number of comments to make. The first is that within the context of marriage, because of the great temptations that are presented to people in those days, and particularly in these, he's saying your body, husband, doesn't belong to you, it belongs to your wife. And your wife's body doesn't belong to her, it belongs to the husband. And so don't deprive each other sexually. That's God's way of helping us navigate through a perilous world. In addition to that, he says that if a couple is engaged, or if they, want to get married, they should. It's the safer thing to do. And so, in our current context, there are many reasons that people give to not get married, and they do so at their peril. There are some traditions and some cultures that put a pause on marriage. That's against Scripture. There are some parents that put a pause on marriage. There's some people who think, I've got to have a degree, I've got to have a house, I've got to own a car, I've got to have sorted myself out financially before I get married. It's not in line with the Scripture. The Scripture says what's more important is that you hear from God who to marry, and that you fulfill your marital duties to each other, and you live righteously in a world that's gone mad. Then he talks about unequally yoked couples. So in other words, if a believing woman is married to an unbelieving husband, he basically saying, stay married. Just because you now got saved, don't divorce your husband, because your children are at stake. But he says, if an unbeliever says, I'm going to leave you, you leave. Basically, this is what would have happened. Denounce your faith, or I'm leaving you. Well, let him leave. And then this is the phrase, you are no longer bound under such circumstances. Now you compare that to the very end of this chapter, where it says that a husband is bound to his wife as long as she lives, but as soon as she dies, then he's no longer bound. It's the same context, same chapter. And so the implication is that if an unbelieving spouse has given a believer an ultimatum and said, I'm leaving you now, I'm going to divorce you, you're no longer bound. And we would think that as well as adultery, this is another case which the Bible gives as not as God's number one plan, but as a concession for divorce and then ultimately remarriage. Now, the other thing that he says is he talks about slavery for a quick moment, and he says, listen, as you come to faith, if you're a slave, don't get into a big knot about that. If you can get your freedom, get it. But actually, you're free. You're free because the Son has set you free. And he said, listen, if you're a freed man and you get into debt or whatever it is that they did to get themselves into slavery, for goodness sake, don't get yourself into slavery. Christ has made you free. And so scriptures like this that spurred on the great emancipation of slave activists that a couple of 100 years ago. And so you see, God's heart is for people to live free from sexual tyranny, live free from oppression from others, as we saw in the chapter in 2 Samuel 10, live free from slavery, free from oppression. That's God's intent for all of us.